June 1st, 1862. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia is broken. Its previous commander is carried off the field on a stretcher, a shell fragment lodged in his shoulder. The Union Army of the Potomac, 105,000 strong, sits less than 7 miles from the Confederate capital of Richmond. Its commander, George B. McClellan, holds every advantage: numbers, supplies, artillery, momentum. He has been advancing for weeks. Victory feels inevitable. Abraham Lincoln is in his study. His generals are confident. The newspapers are already drafting headlines. And then Jefferson Davis makes the strangest, most improbable decision of his presidency. He hands command of the Army of Northern Virginia to a 55-year-old general who hasn't led troops in a major engagement in 11 months. A man who spent the first year of the war losing battles in Western Virginia, losing the confidence of the Southern press, losing the nickname Granny Lee from critics who thought him too cautious to ever win anything. That man is Robert Edward Lee. What happens next is one of the most astonishing reversals in the history of American warfare. Within 25 days, Lee doesn't just stop McClellan. He drives him backward, 7 battles in 7 days, until the Army of the Potomac is huddled in retreat at Harrison's Landing on the James River. The Richmond campaign finished before it ever really began. And that's just the start. Over the next 2 years, Robert E. Lee, outnumbered in virtually every engagement he ever fights, outgunned, outsupplied, and always running low on everything, defeats, outmaneuvers, or outright humiliates the Union Army's finest commanders one after another. John Pope, Ambrose Burnside, Joseph Hooker, each one demolished. The question isn't whether Lee was brilliant. The question is how and why. What was it about this man that made him so dangerous? What combination of instinct, audacity, reading of terrain, and human psychology allowed him to do what military science said couldn't be done again and again against an enemy with double his resources? That's what we're going to find out. To understand why Robert E. Lee fought the way he did, you have to start with a boy who grew up carrying a burden that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with who he was trying to become. He was born January 19, 1807, at Stratford Hall, a grand plantation house in Westmoreland County, Virginia. On paper, his lineage was extraordinary. His father was Henry Light Horse Harry Lee, cavalry general, Revolutionary War hero, one of George Washington's most admired commanders, the man who stood before Congress after Washington died and delivered the line history has never forgotten. First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. A legend, a hero, a man made of marble, but marble cracks. By the time Robert was old enough to understand the world around him, his father's legend had curdled into something else entirely. Light Horse Harry Lee had the battlefield instincts of a genius and the financial judgment of a man who'd never learned to be afraid of consequences. He poured his money and his creditors' money into land speculation schemes that collapsed one after another. By 1809, he was bankrupt. By 1810, he was inside a debtor's prison in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, locked away while his wife Anne and his children, Robert was just 2 years old, managed alone at Stratford Hall, creditors circling the estate like wolves at the fence line. He got out. He came home. But he wasn't the same, and he knew it. In 1812, when Robert was 5, a political mob in Baltimore beat Light Horse Harry so severely he tried to defend a newspaper editor that he never fully recovered. He was disfigured. His health was broken. He lingered in the house for another year, a shadow of himself, and then he left. He sailed for the Caribbean in 1813 to find warmth and perhaps to put an ocean between himself and the wreckage of his reputation. Robert was 6 years old. He would never see his father again. Henry Light Horse Harry Lee died on Cumberland Island, Georgia, in 1818 while trying to sail home, too sick to travel any further. He was buried far from Virginia, far from his family, far from everything his name had once meant. Robert was 11 years old when word arrived. He was now the man of the house. His mother, Anne Hill Carter Lee, was chronically ill, confined sometimes to her bedroom for weeks. Robert did the marketing. He managed the household accounts. He helped her in and out of carriages, sat with her during her sick days, ran errands that most boys his age would never have been asked to consider. He learned, before he turned 15, that the world did not pause for grief, that bills still came, that family honor was something you had to rebuild every single morning with your own hands because no one would hand it back to you. And so when Robert E. Lee arrived at West Point in June 1825, 18 years old, he wasn't just a cadet. He was a young man with something to prove that went far deeper than academic achievement. He graduated second in his class of 1829, and that fact alone would make the history books. But the detail that reveals the true measure of Robert E. Lee isn't his class rank, it's the demerits. In 4 years at an institution that ran on discipline, that found violations in posture and uniform creases and timing, Robert E. Lee received exactly 0 demerits, not one. In the entire history of West Point up to that point, no cadet had managed a perfect record. A few came close, none matched it. That isn't discipline. Or rather, it isn't only discipline. It's something older and more desperate than that. It's a young man who watched his father's name turn to ash and decided, somewhere down where instinct lives, that he would never give the world a single thing to point at. No slip, no stumble, no mark against him. He would be what his father had failed to be, irreproachable. His classmates saw a poised, courteous, almost impossibly composed young officer. What they couldn't see was the engine running underneath. A man who'd been quietly outrunning shame since the age of 6. He graduated into the Army Corps of Engineers, and the next 17 years were spent in work that looked unglamorous from the outside and proved to be everything from within. He built fortifications. He surveyed harbors. He redirected the Mississippi River current near St. Louis in a project that engineers still study today, saving the city's port from silting over. The work demanded a kind of seeing that most people never develop. The ability to stand on a piece of ground and understand, almost instinctively, how water moves through it, where soil compresses and where it gives, where a slope holds a defensive line, and where a ravine becomes a killing ground. He was learning to read the earth. He didn't know yet what he'd use that knowledge for. Mexico answered the question. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, was the crucible where every lesson from every year of careful, methodical engineering work became something lethal. Serving under General Winfield Scott during the campaign to capture Mexico City, Lee performed feats of reconnaissance that his contemporaries described in terms usually reserved for fiction. At the Battle of Cerro Gordo in April 1847, Mexican General Santa Anna positioned his army behind what appeared to be an impenetrable defensive line. The front was a wall of artillery. The flanks were lava fields, rough volcanic rock so broken and sharp that Santa Anna had left them unguarded because he believed no army could cross them. Lee crossed them. Alone, on foot, scouting for hours, he found a route through the lava beds that Scott's engineers then improved into a passable track. Scott's army appeared on the Mexican flank from a direction Santa Anna had dismissed as impossible. The Mexican position collapsed. Scott called it the turning point of the campaign. But here's the detail the history books tend to gloss over. What Lee learned in Mexico wasn't bravery alone, and it wasn't engineering alone. It was how armies break. Again and again, he watched defenders crumble, not because they were outfought, but because they were outmaneuvered, surprised at their side or rear, forced to react to a threat they hadn't anticipated, their carefully prepared defenses suddenly facing the wrong direction. The frontal assault was the obvious move. The flank was the decisive one. He carried that knowledge out of Mexico and into the decades that followed. And when the Civil War came, it became his ultimate weapon. The ability to look at a map, look at the ground, look at his enemy's position, and see instantly what his opponent could not. The seam, the gap, the hidden path through the lava field. Scott, the greatest American general of his generation, didn't mince words about what he'd seen in Mexico. He wrote that if he could have the services of one officer for the American side in any future conflict, that officer would be Robert E. Lee. When the Civil War arrived in April 1861, Lee was 54 years old and had given 32 years of his life to an army he loved. He turned down command of the Union forces, an offer that came directly from Scott, the man who'd praised him above every general in the army, not out of enthusiasm for the Confederacy, and certainly not out of any illusion about what secession meant for the country's future. He did it because of Virginia, his home, his mother's grave, the fields where his ruined father's name still, impossibly, carried weight. "Save in defense of my native state," he wrote in April 1861, "I never desire again to draw my sword." He drew it anyway, almost immediately. And that is where the story gets complicated. Because the war Robert E. Lee was about to fight was not a simple war of loyalty. It was a war wrapped around a moral contradiction, one that Lee himself had named in writing years before the first shot was fired. October 16th, 1859. The night is quiet in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, a small town nestled at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, home to a federal armory holding 100,000 rifles and muskets. At 10 South p.m., 18 men, 13 white, 5 black, slip out of the Maryland darkness and seize the armory's bridges. They cut the telegraph lines. They take hostages. Their leader is a 59-year-old Kansas abolitionist named John Brown. He believes he is acting under divine command. His plan is to ignite a slave rebellion that will spread through the southern states like fire through dry grass, destroying the institution of slavery from within. He intends to arm the enslaved with the weapons in the federal arsenal. He has written a constitution for a new provisional government. He has, in his own mind, already won. By morning, the town is surrounded by local militia. By that afternoon, the first men are dead. Brown pulls back to the engine house, a heavy brick building, with his dwindling band and his hostages, and then Washington sends for someone to end it. The officer who receives the order is a colonel on leave from his Texas posting, passing through Washington on personal business. He is dispatched to Harpers Ferry with a small force of U.S. Marines and told to resolve the situation. His name is Robert E. Lee. He arrives on the night of October 17th, assesses the situation with the calm, methodical precision that defined everything he did, and makes his plan. He'll offer Brown one chance to surrender. If Brown refuses, the Marines will storm the engine house. He selects Lieutenant J.E.B. Stewart, a man who would later become his cavalry commander, to carry the surrender offer to the door. Brown refuses. At 7 a.m. on October 18th, 1859, Lee gives the order. Marines batter down the engine house door with a heavy ladder. The fight inside lasts less than 3 minutes. John Brown is captured, wounded, dragged out into the morning light. He is tried for treason, murder, and conspiracy in a Virginia courtroom, convicted, and hanged on December 2, 1859. Lee files his after-action report and returns to Texas. He described the whole affair as the work of a fanatic. He wrote to his wife that Brown was a man of clear head, but misguided, and that the whole enterprise had been the attempt of a fanatic or madman. He was professionally satisfied with how it had been handled. What Lee did not write, what he perhaps could not fully see from inside the moment, was that Harper's Ferry had just lit the fuse on the war he would spend the next 6 years fighting. John Brown became a martyr in the North. Ralph Waldo Emerson said he would make the gallows as glorious as the cross. Frederick Douglass said Brown had done more to strike at slavery in a single night than a decade of speeches. In the South, the terror of slave rebellion, always present, always suppressed, surged into political hysteria. The already fracturing Democratic Party split along sectional lines in 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. South Carolina seceded in December. The world Robert E. Lee had contained inside that engine house door burst open anyway. And now here is the hardest thing about Robert E. Lee, the thing that his admirers have sometimes soft-pedaled and his critics have sometimes oversimplified, but that any serious accounting of his life has to confront directly. In December 1856, 3 years before Harpers Ferry, Lee had written a letter to his wife that contained a passage historians have debated ever since. He called slavery a moral and political evil in any country. He wrote that its effects on white society were worse than its effects on the enslaved, which tells you something about the limits of his moral imagination. But the words moral and political evil are there, on paper, in his own hand. He knew what it was. He knew, and he continued to live within it. The Arlington estate he occupied, technically his wife Mary's property, inherited from her father, George Washington Parke Custis, was a slaveholding household. When Custis died in 1857, he left complicated, contradictory instructions for the emancipation of the estate's enslaved people. Lee, as executor of the estate, delayed the process for years, and during that period, the enslaved at Arlington continued to work under conditions that surviving testimony describes as difficult and sometimes brutal. When 3 enslaved people attempted to escape in 1859, Lee had them returned and, according to accounts recorded after the war, ordered their punishment. He held the institution he called evil. He benefited from it, managed it, and when Virginia seceded, he chose it over the country he'd served for 32 years. How do you hold those two things at once? A private conscience that named slavery as evil, and a public life that preserved it? The honest answer is that Lee resolved the contradiction by subordinating it to something he valued more: Virginia, his state, his people, the world that had shaped everything he was and everything he feared losing. He wasn't fighting for slavery in any ideological sense. He said so himself, repeatedly. He was fighting for Virginia. But Virginia's economy, Virginia's society, Virginia's political order was built on slavery, and protecting Virginia meant protecting the system that made it possible. Some historians call this the tragedy of Robert E. Lee. Others call it something less forgiving. What it means for the story of his military genius is this: the man who became the most dangerous general in America was fighting a war he'd described privately as morally wrong, in defense of an institution he'd called evil, on behalf of a state he couldn't bring himself to leave. The weight of those contradictions never left him. Whether they sharpened him or haunted him, or both, is something you can spend a long time wondering about. Now, the failures came first. Before Lee became the Gray Fox of legend, he had to survive being Granny Lee. His first field command as a Confederate general was a disaster by any honest measure. In the autumn of 1861, Davis sent him to Western Virginia, present-day West Virginia, to coordinate Confederate forces trying to hold the Allegheny Mountain region against a Union advance. The campaign fell apart almost immediately. His subordinate commanders, Henry Wise and John Floyd, despised each other with a personal intensity that made coordinated military action essentially impossible. Roads were mud, supply lines barely existed. The mountains swallowed men, mules, and plans with equal indifference. In September 1861, Lee attempted a coordinated assault on Union positions at Cheat Mountain, and it unraveled before it began. A subordinate commander lost his nerve and failed to attack on schedule. The whole operation collapsed without a serious engagement. The Confederate press had its knives out. Evacuating Lee, they called him. Granny Lee. The Richmond Examiner all but demanded his removal. A general who planned meticulously and still couldn't produce results looked to civilian readers like a man who simply didn't want to fight. What those critics missed was that Lee was absorbing lessons his enemies would eventually pay for. Western Virginia showed him exactly what happened when a command structure didn't trust itself. When officers held back, improvised without authorization, put their own judgment above the plan, he'd need something different when his moment came. He'd need men who understood what he wanted before he finished asking. Davis brought him back to Richmond and gave him a desk, a military advisor with no troops to command. Lee traveled to the Carolina and Georgia coasts and spent months building an inland defensive network, pulling exposed Confederate positions back from the shoreline and constructing a layered system of fortifications designed to absorb Union amphibious assaults without catastrophic loss. The Confederacy's coastal territory shrank, and the newspapers called it retreat. What Lee was building was strategic depth, a concept the military academy hadn't fully named yet. Don't defend everything. Defend what matters. Make the enemy pay for every foot while preserving your own force for the moment it counts. He was writing the playbook. His own side couldn't read it yet. Then Joseph Johnston took a shell fragment at Fair Oaks on May 31st, 1862, and everything changed. When Lee took command on June 1st, 1862, the Army of Northern Virginia was a defensive force bracing for a siege. McClellan's 105,000-man Army of the Potomac had been methodically tightening its grip on Richmond for weeks, moving forward with artillery parks and supply infrastructure designed to simply grind the Confederate capital into submission. Given enough time, McClellan would win without taking serious risks. Time was the weapon. Lee decided to take it away. His first act surprised everyone who heard about it. He ordered massive construction of field fortifications around Richmond's eastern approaches. His own officers stared at those orders and thought, the man is building a turtle shell. But the fortifications weren't meant for hiding behind. They were meant to free up troops, to leave the thinnest possible garrison holding the eastern line so that Lee could pull every available soldier together for something his subordinates found genuinely alarming. He was going to attack. James Longstreet, one of his most experienced division commanders, later wrote that the staff meeting where Lee outlined his plan produced expressions of actual alarm. McClellan had them outnumbered by roughly 30,000 men. Richmond was 7 miles away. The obvious, prudent, rational move was to dig in and hold. Lee didn't explain himself at length. He simply gave the orders. Now here is what you have to understand about what Lee was actually planning, because this is where his genius reveals itself, and it has almost nothing to do with maneuver. Lee had spent weeks studying one man, George Brinton McClellan. McClellan was, by any objective measure, a gifted organizer and a beloved commander. His men adored him. He'd transformed a shattered, demoralized army after the Union disaster at First Bull Run into the most powerful military force the Western Hemisphere had ever seen. He was careful, meticulous, and brilliant at preparation. He was also paralyzed by something that lived deep in his psychology, the fear of losing. McClellan believed, with a sincerity that defied all evidence, that he was always outnumbered. And feeding that belief was his chief intelligence officer, a famous Pinkerton detective named Allan Pinkerton. Pinkerton used a methodology of counting Confederate campfires, questioning deserters, and extrapolating, and he consistently, wildly, and catastrophically inflated his estimates of Confederate strength. He told McClellan that Lee commanded 180,000 men around Richmond. The real number was approximately 92,000. Pinkerton was essentially handing McClellan a map of ghosts, and McClellan read it with total faith. Lee knew this. Not the specific numbers. He couldn't have known Pinkerton's exact figures, but he understood the pattern of McClellan's behavior. A man who moves this slowly when he has every advantage is a man who believes he has less than he has. A man who asks for 50,000 more troops when he already has 105,000 is a man who has convinced himself he is the underdog. That man could be broken without ever outfighting him. You simply had to attack. Not because attacking would win individual battles. The 7 days battles, June 25th through July 1st, 1862, were often a tactical mess. Jackson arrived late to Mechanicsville on June 26th, mystifyingly late, missing his moment entirely. Historians still debate why. Exhaustion from weeks of campaigning, illness, The absence of explicit enough orders from Lee's characteristically loose command style, or something else entirely. The Confederate assaults were frequently uncoordinated. The casualties Lee's army suffered were horrific. Approximately 20,000 Confederate dead, wounded, or missing against roughly 16,000 Union casualties. By the cold arithmetic of individual engagements, Lee lost most of the 7 days. But here's the thing. Every time Lee attacked, regardless of whether the attack succeeded, it did the same thing inside McClellan's headquarters. It confirmed McClellan's darkest conviction. If they're attacking, they must have reserves I don't know about. After Mechanicsville, after Gaines's Mill, after each bloody Confederate assault, McClellan didn't adjust to the reality that Lee was weaker than he looked. He doubled down on the nightmare. He sent a telegram to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton after Gaines's Mill that said, in writing, "I have lost this battle because my force was too small. If I save this army now, I tell you plainly that I owe no thanks to you or to any other persons in Washington." He was already in retreat in his own mind before his army moved an inch. Lee was fighting a psychological campaign disguised as a military one. Each attack was less a tactical operation than a dose of the medication that kept McClellan's paranoia fully active, and it worked, precisely, methodically, just as Lee had understood it would. By July 2, 1862, the Army of the Potomac was in full retreat to Harrison's Landing on the James River. Richmond was saved. The Confederacy had its general, and a Union army with every material advantage on earth had just been driven off by a man whose deepest weapon wasn't artillery or infantry. It was a cold, clear understanding of what lived in his opponent's head. Lee just saved Richmond, outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting a war inside his enemy's mind. If this kind of story is what you're here for, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this ahead. No honest examination of Lee's success during 1862 and early 1863 can ignore the man who made the most audacious parts of it physically possible, Thomas Jonathan Jackson. Stonewall Jackson was, in many ways, Lee's opposite. Where Lee was polished, courteous, a product of Virginia aristocracy who wore his authority like a well-tailored coat, Jackson was awkward, deeply devout, frequently strange, a professor at Virginia Military Institute who sucked lemons during battle and kept his arm raised above his head during long marches because he believed it improved his blood circulation. He ate standing up. He fell asleep sitting in the saddle mid-campaign. His own men sometimes thought him half mad. He was also the most gifted corps commander in the war on either side. What Jackson gave Lee was the ability to make the impossible geometrically possible. Specifically, the ability to move infantry faster than any Union commander believed infantry could move. During the Shenandoah Valley campaign of spring 1862, Jackson's corps marched so relentlessly that Union commanders genuinely couldn't track where he was from week to week. Between March 23 and June 9, 1862, Jackson fought 5 pitched battles, outmaneuvered 3 separate Union armies with a combined force double his own, and tied down 60,000 Federal troops who might otherwise have reinforced McClellan's drive on Richmond. He accomplished all of it with approximately 17,000 men. Lee and Jackson built a working relationship rooted in a kind of wordless, mutual understanding that was almost eerie in its efficiency. Lee gave Jackson what the historian James I. Robertson Jr. called a loose rein and a clear objective. He told Jackson where he needed to be and what needed to happen. He didn't micromanage the how. Jackson would disappear into the countryside and reappear exactly where Lee needed him, or close enough that the difference didn't matter. Their greatest collaboration, and their most psychologically sophisticated operation, came at Second Bull Run in late August 1862. Lee's opponent was John Pope, a Union general who'd made a series of spectacular errors before the first shot was fired. Pope publicly boasted of his Western successes. He insulted the fighting quality of the Virginia Army. He issued orders requiring his troops to subsist off the land, essentially authorizing foraging from Virginia civilians, that enraged the Confederate high command. Lee, who almost never allowed personal feelings to color military decisions, called Pope a miscreant in a letter to Jefferson Davis. He told Davis he wanted Pope suppressed. But the plan Lee conceived went far beyond personal satisfaction. It was a masterpiece of applied psychological manipulation, built on his reading of Pope the same way the 7 Days had been built on his reading of McClellan. Pope was not a paranoid man. He was, if anything, the opposite: overconfident, aggressive, certain of his own superiority. That was the weakness. A man who's sure he's winning doesn't look for threats he hasn't anticipated. He looks for the enemy he expects, in the place he expects them. Lee would put the enemy somewhere Pope had no category for. With the Union Army of Virginia positioned along the Rappahannock River and the Army of the Potomac beginning to reinforce it from the east, Lee ordered Jackson's corps, roughly 23,000 men, on a 54-mile march around Pope's right flank, deep into his rear, to fall upon the massive Union supply depot at Manassas Junction. Jackson did it in 2 days, moving at a pace that modern military historians still find difficult to fully explain without resorting to the word supernatural. When Jackson's men arrived at Manassas on August 26, 1862, they found over $1 million worth of Union supplies: canned lobster, fresh bread, barrels of whiskey, medicine, artillery ammunition, whole warehouses of equipment that the Confederate Army had been going without for months. They ate. Men who'd been surviving on half rations since June sat down among the plenty and ate until they couldn't move. They loaded their haversacks with everything they could carry. Then they burned what remained, and the smoke column was visible for 20 miles in every direction. Pope turned to chase Jackson. That was what Lee needed. Pope, enraged and confused, swung north to find Jackson, and in doing so, he turned his back on Longstreet's corps of 30,000 men advancing from the west. Lee's trap was set with glacial precision. Jackson's men took up position behind an unfinished railroad embankment near the old Bull Run battlefield on August 29th and simply held, absorbing Pope's furious piecemeal attacks through the afternoon while giving up nothing. Pope, watching Jackson's men bend and hold and bend and hold without breaking, convinced himself they were about to collapse. He sent messages to Washington that night announcing victory. He was certain Jackson was retreating. He'd still somehow failed to notice the 30,000 men on his left flank. At 4 p.m., on August 30th, 1862, James Longstreet unleashed the largest simultaneous mass assault of the entire Civil War. 5 divisions, 25,000 men, rolling across Pope's exposed left flank like a door slamming shut. The Union line didn't bend, it shattered. By nightfall, Pope's army was streaming toward Washington in full retreat. Lee had now driven 2 Union armies off the field in less than 60 days. He'd done it not by outgunning them, he couldn't outgun them, but by finding the specific crack in each commander's psychology and driving a wedge into it until something gave way. McClellan's weakness was his paranoia. Pope's weakness was his certainty. Lee had exploited both with the same cold precision. But he wasn't done, and September was coming. Picture this. You're George McClellan. You're sitting in your headquarters with 105,000 men, every gun you need, and the Confederate capital 7 miles away. And somewhere out there, Lee is moving again. You have a map. You have reports. And every report tells you the enemy is bigger than he actually is. If you were standing in McClellan's boots, staring at a map full of illusions, what would your next move have been? Drop it in the comments. September 17th, 1862, is the bloodiest single day in American military history. By the time the sun went down on the cornfields and sunken roads outside Sharpsburg, Maryland, approximately 22,617 men were dead, wounded, or missing. The creek running through the battlefield gave the battle its northern name, Antietam. The Confederates called it Sharpsburg. Either way, it was catastrophe measured in human beings, and it changed the war in ways that went far beyond who held the field at nightfall. After Second Bull Run, Lee made the decision to carry the war north. The logic was sound. A Confederate army operating on northern soil might finally push Britain and France toward formal recognition of the Confederacy as a sovereign nation, a diplomatic prize the South had been pursuing since Fort Sumter. It could demoralize the Northern public in the weeks before the crucial November 1862 midterm elections. It might allow war-ravaged Virginia one season to recover before the armies came back. What it required was a victory on northern soil, something Lee had every intention of delivering. What he didn't know, what no one in the Confederate High Command could have predicted, was that a Union corporal would find a copy of his complete campaign orders wrapped around 3 cigars in a field near Frederick, Maryland, on September 13, 1862. Special Orders, number 191. Lee's entire plan of march, where every Confederate division was going, when they were moving, and what they were supposed to accomplish, sitting in the dirt, waiting. It landed on George McClellan's desk. McClellan's reaction to holding the most valuable piece of battlefield intelligence of the entire war was, characteristically, to do almost nothing with it. He told Lincoln he had Lee's plans and would move with great haste. Then he waited 16 hours before issuing the first order to advance. Historians have never fully resolved why. Some believe he doubted the document's authenticity. Others argue his pathological caution simply overrode even this extraordinary windfall. A few suggest that McClellan, deep down, didn't want to destroy Lee's army, that what he wanted was a negotiated peace, and a shattered Confederate force couldn't negotiate. Whatever the reason, those 16 hours gave a Confederate sympathizer enough time to warn Lee that his orders were compromised. Lee immediately began pulling his scattered divisions together near Sharpsburg, the Potomac River at his back. He had, at the start of the battle, fewer than 40,000 men against McClellan's 87,000. On September 17th, McClellan attacked, and true to his character, he did it piecemeal. Corps went in one at a time rather than simultaneously, giving Lee's outnumbered army the chance to shift troops from quiet sectors to plug the gaps as they appeared. The fighting that day was among the most savage in American military history. The sunken road, a farm lane worn below grade by years of use, became Bloody Lane as Confederate defenders held it for 3 hours against repeated Union assaults, until the position finally collapsed. At the stone bridge over Antietam Creek, 500 Georgia riflemen held 12,000 Union soldiers at bay for 3 hours while Lee scrambled to reinforce his left. At 3:30 p.m., and with the Union Ninth Corps finally across the bridge and threatening to cut off Lee's line of retreat entirely, A.P. Hill's division arrived from Harpers Ferry, 3,000 men who'd marched 17 miles in 8 hours, arriving still in march column, crashing into the Union flank from the south and stopping the breakthrough cold. Lee held the line through the night. Then he withdrew back across the Potomac. He'd survived. Technically, he'd walked away with his army. But what happened next is where Antietam's true significance lives, and it's not on that cornfield. Abraham Lincoln had been waiting. He'd drafted a document weeks earlier and was told by Secretary of State William Seward that he couldn't release it after a string of Union defeats. It would look desperate. It would look like the cry of a government losing the war. He needed a victory first, or at least something he could frame as one. Antietam gave him that. On September 22, 1862, 5 days after the battle, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that on January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in states still in rebellion would be legally free. The document transformed the war. Before Antietam, the conflict was, officially, a war for the preservation of the Union. That framing had political advantages. It kept the loyal border states, which were slaveholding, from bolting to the Confederacy. But it also left the war's moral stakes somewhat ambiguous, particularly in the eyes of Europe. Before Antietam, the British government was genuinely debating whether to offer mediation, which would have effectively recognized Confederate independence. A faction in the cabinet, led by Prime Minister Palmerston and Foreign Secretary Russell, was watching Confederate military success and calculating that the South had effectively won its independence already. Antietam, just barely, just enough, stopped that calculation. It gave Lincoln the moment he needed, and the Emancipation Proclamation made the Confederate cause politically untouchable in Europe. Here's why that mattered so completely. Britain had abolished slavery in its empire in 1833. France had followed in 1848. Both nations had abolitionist movements with real political power. The moment the war became, unambiguously, a war about slavery, a war where the Union side was fighting against it, public opinion in both countries made any government support for the Confederacy impossible. British textile workers were suffering genuine economic hardship from the cotton shortage caused by the Union naval blockade. They still held mass meetings in cities across England in support of the Union cause, because the principle outweighed their personal economic pain. The Confederate Commissioner to Britain, James Mason, understood immediately what the Emancipation Proclamation meant. He wrote to Jefferson Davis that the political possibility of British recognition had effectively closed. He was right. Britain and France never formally recognized the Confederacy. Without that recognition, without the possibility of European loans, European warships, and European diplomatic leverage to force a negotiated peace, the Confederacy's long-term survival depended entirely on exhausting the North militarily. And exhausting the North militarily meant continuing to bleed it, and for that, they needed Lee. What Antietam cost Lee wasn't territory or manpower. Both losses were manageable. What it cost him was the political framework that might have made Confederate independence possible without military victory. Every battle he fought from September 1862 onward was a fight with no exit other than the one he made himself. There would be no British fleet to challenge the Union blockade. There would be no French diplomatic intervention. There would be no negotiated settlement driven by European self-interest. It was just Lee, his army, and mathematics that didn't favor him. He held the line through winter. And then, in the spring of 1863, he did something so daring that military historians are still arguing about how it was even possible. If Antietam showed Lee's vulnerability, the next 6 months showed something different. They showed a commander operating at the absolute outer limits of what was militarily possible, and winning in a way that left his opponents feeling not just defeated, but somehow personally outmaneuvered, as if they'd lost before they understood the game had already started. December 13th, 1862. Fredericksburg, Virginia. Ambrose Burnside had replaced McClellan after Antietam and immediately launched an assault against Lee's entrenched army on the heights south of the Rappahannock. The Union Army crossed the river and charged uphill across 400 yards of open ground toward Confederate positions on Mary's Heights, where Lee had positioned artillery and infantry behind a stone wall at the base of the slope. 14 times, Union brigades charged that wall. 14 times, they were repulsed. By the end of the day, the Union Army had suffered approximately 12,600 casualties to the Confederates' 5,300. Lee watched the slaughter from a hilltop with Longstreet. Seeing the Federal lines break again and again against his fortifications, he turned to his corps commander and said something that has echoed through military history ever since. "It is well that war is so terrible. We should grow too fond of it." There's something in that sentence worth sitting with. Not just the horror it acknowledges, but the cold clarity of the mind that produced it while watching men die. Lee understood what was happening on that field at a level his opponents couldn't match. He'd designed the killing ground. He knew exactly how the geometry of it would work. And it troubled him. It deeply troubled him. But it didn't stop him. Burnside was replaced by Joseph Hooker. Fighting Joe Hooker was, by many accounts, the most impressive Union General Lee had faced yet. He spent the winter of 1862-63 rebuilding the Army of the Potomac into a formidable, reorganized fighting force, dramatically improving morale, intelligence gathering, and logistical efficiency. By April 1863, he had assembled 130,000 men and developed a genuinely brilliant operational plan. Leave a third of his force south of Fredericksburg to fix Lee in place, and march the rest in a wide flanking arc around Lee's left flank to appear deep in his rear. It was the kind of plan that Lee himself might have written. "My plans are perfect," Hooker told his staff, "and when I start to carry them out, may God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none." He was not entirely wrong about his plan. He was catastrophically wrong about the man across from him. Lee received word of Hooker's flanking movement on May 1, 1863. He had 60,000 men. Hooker had him outnumbered more than 2-1. The standard military response in that situation is to retreat, hold one line, disengage, fall back to better ground, force the enemy to come to you. Lee did the opposite. He went forward. He met Hooker's advancing columns at the edge of a dense tangled forest known as the Wilderness, near a crossroads called Chancellorsville. And that evening, around a small campfire in the Virginia dark, Lee sat with Jackson and conceived the decision that most military historians considered the most daring act of command in the entire Civil War. He would divide his army into 3 pieces, in the face of an enemy twice his size. One thin division, roughly 10,000 men, would hold Hooker's 70,000 at Chancellorsville itself. Jackson, with 28,000 men, would march 12 miles around Hooker's exposed right flank on a route Lee's cavalry had scouted through the forest. Whatever remained, perhaps 14,000 men, would stay opposite Union forces at Fredericksburg. Every military manual ever written says you don't divide your force in the face of a superior enemy. Lee divided it into thirds. On May 2, 1863, Jackson's corps marched. Confederate columns moved through the forest for most of the day, spotted occasionally by Union cavalry, whose frantic reports went mostly unheeded. Howard's 18th Corps, posted on the Union right flank, received warning after warning and largely ignored them. Their pickets faced west. Jackson was moving south. It didn't seem like a threat. At 5:15 p.m., a rabbit ran out of the underbrush ahead of Jackson's advancing line. The Union pickets saw the rabbit. They thought nothing of it. 2 minutes later, 28,000 screaming Confederate soldiers erupted from the tree line and hit the Union right flank with the force of a train derailment. Oliver Howard's 12,000 men broke in minutes and ran, streaming back toward Chancellorsville, abandoning rifles, abandoning supper, still cooking over fires, the entire right side of Hooker's perfect plan collapsing like wet paper in a fist. Hooker himself, standing on the porch of the Chancellor House when a Confederate shell struck the supporting column, was knocked senseless. He was likely concussed for the next 12 critical hours. The Union Army of the Potomac was, for all practical purposes, leaderless at its moment of greatest crisis. By May 4th, the Army of the Potomac was retreating across the Rappahannock. Lee had won his most complete, most studied, most improbable victory. He'd also lost the partner who made it possible. Returning from a nighttime reconnaissance on May 2nd, Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men, Confederate pickets who didn't recognize the riders approaching in the dark. He was hit 3 times. His left arm was amputated. When Lee was told, he sent a message that read, in part, "Could I have directed events? I should have chosen for the good of the country to have been disabled in your place." Jackson died 8 days later of pneumonia. He was 39 years old. Lee had lost his right arm. He said so himself. Chancellorsville was the peak. Everything after it was descent. This isn't hindsight. Lee himself understood, in some intuitive way, that time was running out. The Confederate economy was fracturing under Union naval blockades. The Army of Northern Virginia was losing men it couldn't replace. At Chancellorsville alone, 13,000 irreplaceable veterans killed or wounded. The Western Theater was hemorrhaging Confederate territory. Vicksburg was under siege. Lee believed, with some justification, that one decisive victory on Northern soil might still shift the political calculation in Washington before the 1864 elections. He invaded Pennsylvania in June 1863. He did it without Jackson. He did it with a reorganized command structure he hadn't had time to fully test. James Longstreet now commanded the E Corps. Brilliant, reliable, powerful, but slower to attack than Lee preferred, and increasingly convinced that offensive warfare in this conflict was a path to ruin. Richard Ewell led Jackson's old II Corps, a man Lee didn't yet know at the corps level. A.P. Hill commanded the new III Corps. These were capable men. They weren't Jackson. On July 1, 1863, the armies collided accidentally near a Pennsylvania crossroads town called Gettysburg. A Confederate division searching for shoes, the Army of Northern Virginia was chronically short of footwear, encountered Union cavalry under John Buford, who dismounted his men and held the high ground south of town until Union infantry arrived. For 3 days, Lee attacked. Historians still debate why he kept attacking at Gettysburg. The Army of the Potomac, now under George Meade, held superb defensive terrain on Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill. Longstreet argued repeatedly for a sweeping flanking movement. Get between the Army of the Potomac and Washington, force Meade to attack on ground of Lee's choosing. It was the same thinking that had won Chancellorsville. Lee refused. Some historians point to the tactical opportunities that appeared real enough at the time. The Confederate near success on Little Round Top on July 2nd genuinely came within minutes of breaking the Union left entirely. Others note that Lee was suffering from what may have been early symptoms of the cardiac disease that would kill him 7 years later, and that his judgment may have been subtly compromised in ways even he wasn't aware of. On July 3rd, he ordered 12,500 men to march across 3/4 of a mile of open ground toward the Union Center on Cemetery Ridge, what history would call Pickett's Charge. He believed the Union Center had been weakened by the previous day's fighting. He was wrong. Of the 12,500 men who stepped off that ridge, fewer than half returned. Lee rode among the survivors as they came back, saying over and over, "This is my fault. It is all my fault." He wasn't wrong. After Gettysburg, the strategic picture became increasingly clear. The Confederacy could not win an offensive war. Lee's genius had kept the Army of Northern Virginia alive and Richmond intact, but it hadn't changed the fundamental arithmetic. The Union had 22 million people. The Confederacy had 9 million, of whom 3.5 million were enslaved and not available as soldiers. The Union's industrial output in 1863 alone exceeded the entire Confederate economy. For every soldier Lee killed, 2 more appeared to replace him. For every man Lee lost, there was no replacement waiting. Ulysses S. Grant arrived in the East in March 1864, and the war became something entirely different. Grant didn't fight like McClellan, always probing, then retreating when resistance stiffened. He didn't fight like Pope, boasting, then collapsing. He didn't fight like Burnside, hurling men at prepared positions and wondering why they died. Grant understood that the only thing Lee couldn't survive was relentless, grinding attrition, a commander who kept attacking not because he expected to win each engagement, but because he knew Lee couldn't keep absorbing the losses. The overland campaign of May-June 1864 was merciless. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. Lee repulsed every frontal attack. His defensive genius was, if anything, even more formidable than his offensive brilliance. In 2 months of brutal fighting, Lee's army inflicted approximately 55,000 Union casualties, while suffering around 35,000 of its own. By any previous standard, Grant should have stopped. He didn't stop. He moved south. That was the difference. Lee could win battles. Grant could lose battles and still win wars. By June 1864, Lee was behind the fortifications of Petersburg, his army fixed in place, the war of mobility he'd mastered reduced to a siege he'd always known he couldn't sustain. Grant had turned him into exactly what he'd spent 3 years fighting not to become. A static defender, digging in, waiting for the end. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered. He rode out on his gray horse Traveler to meet Grant, dressed in his finest uniform, every button polished. Some have found irony in that. The defeated general dressed as if reporting for his greatest victory. Others see something simpler. A man who'd given everything he had, lost, and intended to face the ending with the same composure he'd carried since the age of 6. Grant's terms were generous. Lee's men could keep their horses for the spring plowing. Officers kept their sidearms. No mass arrests. No trials for treason. The men who fought alongside Lee broke down and wept when word of the surrender reached them. They crowded the road as he rode back through the Confederate lines, reaching out to touch his horse, his coat, his hand. So what made Robert E. Lee so difficult to defeat? When you trace the full arc of his career, several things emerge. He read terrain better than almost any commander in American military history. His engineering background gave him an instinct for ground, where it was strong, where it was weak, where an army could hide, and where it couldn't move. At Fredericksburg, at Chancellorsville, in the trenches of Petersburg, he consistently found the ground that multiplied the value of every man he had. He understood his opponents not just as military commanders, but as human beings with specific, exploitable psychologies. McClellan's paralysis, Pope's overconfidence, Hooker's inability to hold his nerve when the situation turned against him. Lee gathered intelligence relentlessly. J.E.B. Stuart gave him a picture of Union movements that most Confederate commanders never had, and he acted on what he learned with a decisiveness that few opponents could match. He was audacious in a way that military science said he had no right to be. The standard doctrinal response when outnumbered 2-1 is to dig in and defend. Lee's response, again and again, was to attack, divide his force, make the enemy react to him rather than the other way around. He understood that a smaller force controlling the tempo of a campaign is more dangerous than a larger one that doesn't. He inspired his men with something beyond loyalty. Soldiers in the Army of Northern Virginia followed him not out of obligation, but out of a faith that bordered on the religious. They believed he would find a way, that faith produced soldiers who marched further, held longer, and fought harder than anyone had the right to expect. And ultimately, those same qualities contained the seeds of the failure that became Gettysburg. The audacity that had won Chancellorsville demanded more from fortune than fortune was prepared to give twice. The aggression that had broken McClellan and Pope and Burnside and Hooker finally met in Grant, a man whose psychological architecture had no crack Lee could drive a wedge into. There are questions that haven't been settled and won't be. What if Lee had listened to Longstreet and flanked around Meade at Gettysburg? What if Jackson hadn't been shot by his own men in the dark on that May road? What if Britain had recognized the Confederacy after Second Bull Run, before Antietam closed the door? Those questions have occupied military historians for 160 years. What can be said is this: Robert E. Lee was given an impossible task: defend a new nation with a fraction of his enemy's resources, manpower, and industrial capacity, and for nearly 3 years, he made it look almost possible. He was also a man who called slavery a moral and political evil, and then spent 4 years fighting to preserve the world that depended on it. He was a man who carried the weight of a ruined father's name into every room he entered, and never stopped trying to outrun it. He was a man whose genius and whose flaws were, in the end, made of the same material. He didn't win the war, but no one else could have kept it going as long as he did. The war ended in a courthouse in Virginia, with 2 tired men and a table between them. Outside, the spring of 1865 was beginning. The dogwoods were blooming. The fields that had grown armies for 4 years were going quiet. 600,000 Americans had died. The country they left behind was broken, exhausted, and, in ways that took another century to fully work through, still fighting. Lee had wanted, above everything, to serve Virginia. He served it to the point of ruin. Whether that service was heroic or tragic or both is a question each generation has to answer for itself. What isn't debatable is what he was capable of in those years between June 1862 and July 1863. a stretch of military performance, under conditions of almost unimaginable constraint, that has few parallels in the history of American arms. He was, in the most complicated and morally weighted sense of the word, extraordinary. The war is over. The questions never quite are. The Civil War is far deeper than any single campaign or any single man. If you want to go deeper on the battles, decisions, and human stories that made America, there's a lot more here. Hit subscribe. The next chapter is already coming.